after I get your images. Okay, go. Good evening.
Okay, good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks and keeping themselves safe and at home and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. On a future note, please remember that our next event is on December 15th with Evan Osnos of the New Yorker magazine to discuss his new biography of President-elect Joe Biden. What a wonderful phrase to say. We'll be joined by his father, Peter Osnos, the well-known publisher and editor of many biographies. You may think you know all about Joe Biden, a national politician for more than 40 years, but that's why we have biographers. They'll tell you things the newspapers don't have the space for. Anyway, please do mark your calendars for December 15th at 6 p.m. But tonight we are here to celebrate Professor Peniel Joseph and his dual biography, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Please look for this new book in your local bookstore or online. Sword and Shield. I love the title. Titles are always hard to craft for a biography, but this is a very intriguing title. Professor Joseph will be in conversation tonight with David Levering Lewis. Dr. Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and Professor of History and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. His work has been featured in the New York Times and many other outlets. Joseph is the author and editor of 6 books on African American history, including the award-winning Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Stokely, A Life. David Levering Lewis is a professor emeritus of history at NYU, New York University, and he's the author of King, a biography, which is now in its 3rd edition, and more recently, The Improbable Wendell Willkie, the businessman who saved the Republican Party and his country and conceived a new world order. His 2-volume life of W.E.B. Du Bois was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for both volumes of his biographies. Professor Joseph and Professor Lewis will now have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our virtual audience. Please remember to click on the little question box below to type in your questions, and David will be sure to get to many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. And again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Dr. Joseph, congratulations on this formidable accomplishment. We all know how hard it is to finish a biography. So on that note, David, I now turn the conversation over to you. Thank you.
Professor Joseph, this is a masterful intellectual duet, one in which each protagonist's deficits are mitigated by the other's virtues, strengths. The Sword and the Shield is a rare exercise in ideological complementarity, a timeline elucidation that frees up and corrects the biographical stereotypes that bedevil Malcolm and Martin. The Malcolm who immemorially startled the public in Mike Wallace's The Hate That Hate Produced in July 1959, or the King dreaming better days on the Washington Mall in August 1963. And permit a self-serving observation as a biographer of W.E.B. Du Bois. I stifle a groan that Du Bois is reduced in public memory to the souls of Black folk. As you write in your introduction, a binary understanding of Malcolm and Martin is incomplete. It shortchanges the political radicalism always inherent in each, even when they seemed to be reformist or reactionary. It's really quite an achievement, I must say, to bring these two men together confrontationally and, as it were, symbiotically. A question. Is the logic of Garvey's Black emigrationism, is it that explains Malcolm's entry into the Nation of Islam, or streetwise opportunism of an ex-felon?
That's a great question. No, I would say it's really a search for family and kinship. It's interesting. One, thank you, Professor Lewis, for being the interlocutor. I've learned so much from your towering scholarship, and also Kai Bird and American Prometheus and what he's done. And you've been an exemplar, really everything from Harlem What is in Vogue to the Wilkie book, which I had the pleasure of reading when I was for Biographers International. You know, the new biography of Malcolm X by the late Les Payne just won the National Book Award.
Yes,
I had the privilege of reading that biography for a review that's going to run. And I think that when you really look at both the Pulitzer Prize winning biography by Manning Marable and then the National Book Award winning biography by Les Payne, by the way, which are the first two major biographies of Malcolm X done by African-American scholars and journalists, right? What you find is that Malcolm X and the Little family really looked to Garveyism as a sinecure for their efforts at really having dignity in Omaha, Nebraska, in Wisconsin, and then in East Lansing, Michigan. And so I think when Malcolm joins the Nation of Islam, he is really going back home again to the last time he felt secure. He goes from being the son of two Black political activists, Earl and Louise Norton Little, who, however idiosyncratically, are tethered together and have this family with 7 children. They have a farm. They at times send their kids to predominantly white schools in areas that are usually not hospitable to Black people. So they're a very interesting family in that way. They're pioneering Garveyites, right? And what's so interesting is that after that family breaks up, both because of what we now know is the accidental death of Earl Little, if we look at the research that Les Payne has done and the scores of interviews he did with Malcolm's family, surviving family members, and really going back and reinvestigating the death. After that family is torn apart with the death of Malcolm's father and then the institutionalization of his mother, from about the age of 12 to 20, Malcolm is really experiencing a wayward youth. One of the interesting aspects of the new biography is that it's not just Detroit red we meet East Lansing red. We meet East Lansing, Michigan red. And so I think that he's less of a sly sort of prisoner on the make and much more of a lost soul trying to find his sinecure again in the aftermath of his father's death.
I suppose the debut, in a sense, to the mainstream public is that July 1959 Mike Wallace 5-part presentation. It alarmed, startled, awakened the country, I gather. I hadn't, though, thought that it might have been carefully planned. I learned from you that it was Louis Lomax
Yes.
who composed the guts of it, and then Mike Wallace vocalized it. But what I find is I didn't know that he is returning from Egypt.
Yep.
That Gamal Nasser has invited him to attend the Hajj, or
But
rather,
not the Hajj that time.
Elijah
Yeah,
Muhammad.
he's preparing the Hajj for Elijah.
Yes, and the leader declined and substituted his new acolyte, and so he comes back from Egypt, from an experience that must have been quite extraordinary and even perhaps disorienting to Malcolm. But he comes back really infamous, not so. As I look at the chronology, the Mike Wallace program has just run or is just concluding as Malcolm returns home. Who planned this?
And so the Louis Lomax, The Hate That Hate Produced, is really a product of the Nation of Islam, but led by Malcolm X, trying to expand their horizons. One of the things that we see, and Malcolm's very interesting here, Professor Lewis, when we think about Malcolm X, we think of his charisma and his iconography as something that sort of just happens. And there is some careful planning. He cultivates Black newspaper reporters. He cultivates the African American press. He learns how the press actually is published. When we think about the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender and the Los Angeles Herald Dispatch and the Amsterdam News. So what's so interesting about Malcolm is that Malcolm is writing a column for Black newspapers. He's ghostwriting a column for Elijah Muhammad. He's learning how the Nation of Islam can actually organize their own newspaper, which after a series of fits and starts, they do in 1960 with Muhammad Speaks. And The Hate That Hate Produced is part of that media push. And in many ways, what Malcolm had anticipated, and I think Louis Lomax thought so too, but Mike Wallace was unaware, even if the white media tried to demonize Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, there was going to be a segment of the Black population that recognized that group as something that was homegrown, as something that was connected to Marcus Garvey's movement for self-determination, as something that wasn't negative, even if they disagreed with aspects of it. As we know, the Black capacity for having complex, even contradictory political views is immense and panoramic. I mean, you show it with Du Bois. Du Bois contains multitudes, as you've chronicled his entire life. So Malcolm bets that if we can get this kind of publicity in the long run, it's going to be positive. And he tells that to Elijah Muhammad, who he by this time is calling the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm is proven right. Basically, when we think about The Hate That Hate Produced, it's a 5-part series that has proved so popular, it's repackaged. So by the time Malcolm comes back to the United States, he's seeing a rare rerun of a show. We're thinking this is 1959 because it's so popular. And so the orchestra, the architect of this is really going to be Malcolm X. And also, I will say, with an able assist by Louis Lomax. Louis Lomax, there should be a biography of Louis Lomax, who died in a car accident in 1969, who really produced the first dual effort before James Cone's wonderful book, Malcolm and Martin, Dream versus Nightmare, before The Sword and the Shield. It was a book called To Kill a Black Man in 1969, which is Louis Lomax's last book. So that's one of Malcolm's closest journalistic confidants. And he's an interesting story in his own right. He's somebody who had been arrested, had been incarcerated, had a wayward youth, and transformed himself into one of the most well-known and respected Black journalists of the period.
Yes, indeed. In fact, there's some susurrus about the way in which he died, that perhaps the automobile accident was engineered by enemies, lest he revealed certain things about the doings of deep state people, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. The first time he goes to Washington with a group is, I believe, something called Separation or Death in June of 1961.
Yes.
Now, what did he really mean by separation or death? That the only modality for African Americans' survival was to separate, to leave physically, or to leave culturally, or to leave politically? Or was it to say that by separating, indeed, we will achieve the kind of fullness that we have thus far been deprived of?
Well, yeah, I think he's saying separatism as building parallel institutions. I think when he says separatism or death, and I think in this sense of death, he's talking about the structural violence that is impacting the Black community at an existential level. I think what's remarkable about Malcolm is the way in which very early on he's able to tap into his knowledge that there's this existential crisis going on between race and democracy, and black citizenship and dignity. And so when he says separation or death, I think what he's arguing for is Black people being able to build parallel institutions. He has great, and in The Sword and the Shield, I document this, there are great debates with Bayard Rustin, with James Farmer, with Louis Lomax, with James Baldwin, with Dr. Kenneth Clark, one of the most esteemed social scientists of the 20th century, where Malcolm is really, he puts them into a rhetorical corner because they tell him separatism is foolish, it's folly. He says, no, racial integration is foolish and folly because separatism is a choice where Black people are going to build their parallel institutions because the United States is so irredeemably racist, according to Malcolm's argument here. Black people are never going to be racially integrated into the society. And when they push back, Malcolm reminds them that the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments were supposed to have, in Malcolm's words, solve the race problem. Malcolm famously says Abraham Lincoln was supposed to solve the race problem. Then a white man named Kennedy was supposed to solve the race problem. So Malcolm is an expert at narrating these stories, these analogies, these metaphors, right? These homespun fables that in some ways he had listened growing up to his father Earl and his mother Louise had told him stories of Blackness, and he's able to sort of recraft those with this immense intellect that is self-learned. He is an autodidact along the likes of Richard Wright and James Baldwin and these other autodidacts who are sort of incredibly brilliant and self-taught. So when he says separation or death, Malcolm's vision of racial separatism forces Black people, including Dr. King, to sort of grapple with the existential crisis of being Black in America.
There is curiously no evidence except a single photo of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X meeting. And I believe it's in Washington. It's in the chambers of the Senate or the hallways of the Senate. It's an affecting photograph. It's conspiratorial a little bit. It's also a bit cagey. It's a great smile, and you are not surprised. I was not surprised that a few years later, when he is in Selma, he does not meet Martin Luther King during that period, but he confides in Mrs. King in Coretta that he's there. People say, my goodness, he's there as a spoiler. Why, he's there to ruin the nonviolent majesty of and efficacy of this movement. And he says, no, I'm sort of being the bad cop.
Yes.
I am the one. White people will say, oh, we'd better give King some credence because there is Malcolm as an alternative. And of course she conveyed that confidence to Martin Luther King, and I'm sure he did appreciate the fact that that he was an alternative. He was, as you put it, the prosecuting attorney of our history, and King is the defender. There's a good reason, though, to believe that perhaps Martin Luther King should have listened to Coretta, because when we look at King at work, we see that there are more failures than successes. Albany, Georgia, is a failure. It remains as segregated as the day before Martin Luther King decided to arrive. Montgomery is a disappointment. Reverend Shuttlesworth, I seem to recall saying, if you're going to be here, you should have stayed here long enough to wrap up a deal that was really meaningful.
Birmingham, Professor.
Birmingham.
Yeah, Birmingham.
Yeah. And then there is Chicago. And the Summit Agreement is, of course, a meaningless document celebrated by Mayor Daley and the establishment and perhaps the AFL-CIO. But it's the beginning of the end of collaboration and confidence on the part of SNCC and on the part of the radicals. I wonder, do you feel that King was perhaps terribly slow in realizing that the perfidy and the opposition of people in the North was such that only an assault upon institutions with a mixture of risk of violence and at the same time a willingness to negotiate would have been far more efficacious? I guess what I'm saying is, does it take him longer to realize that nonviolence will only work if, in fact, the alternative is staring everyone right in the face?
Yeah, I think it does take King a long time. And I think one of the reasons why it does is that he, even though, King is going to argue that Albany, Georgia is not a failure. And he's going to say it's not a failure because even as we didn't transform and end segregation, we raised the consciousness of the people who were there, right? That's what he's going to say. But you're right, in terms of Birmingham, he's going to try to orchestrate Birmingham with the help of the towering local leader, Fred Shuttlesworth. But the agreement that happens in Birmingham is pretty much upended by anti-Black violence. And there's going to be a Black rebellion on Mother's Day, the Mother's Day Rebellion in '63. And there's going to be some disappointment with what happens in Birmingham as well. St. Augustine, Florida is going to be disappointing. The efforts to desegregate St. Augustine, Florida, the night marches, the violence. Malcolm X famously offers to send troops down to King who are going to help the embattled Dr. King, but he says they're not going to turn the other cheek. So I think one of the things that King is banking on, and you see this in '64 and '65, are these dramatic pieces of legislation that get passed. So the July 2nd Civil Rights Act is a game changer. We know we're still dealing with the reverberations of that '64 Civil Rights Act. And certainly the Selma is a game changer in this sense. Even as Malcolm comes to visit King, who's incarcerated, and Malcolm is assassinated just two weeks and a few days later, the March 7th Bloody Sunday debacle in Selma really becomes a debacle for white supremacy, right? So something that started out much smaller, by the time James Reeb, the white seminarian from Boston, is murdered by racist thugs, it's going to compel Lyndon Johnson really to have his finest moment as president on March 15th, 1965, when Johnson talks about the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. He ends that speech with "We shall overcome." So I think that that's going to lead to both the successful Selma to Montgomery demonstration from March 21st to March 25th. And remember, Professor Lewis, the two times King speaks before a national audience in its entirety, his entirety of speech, is going to be August 28th, 1963 at the March on Washington. And then the next is really March 25th, 1965. So the last time the entire American public listens to a speech by King, it's in 65. And I think that's one of the reasons why we freeze frame King in 65, because those are sort of the high points. I think that after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the explosion in Watts, King comes to see that you need transformative nonviolent civil disobedience. And he has the great essay Beyond the Los Angeles Riots, where he starts to echo Malcolm. So he starts to say he's going to use civil disobedience as a peaceful, as a nonviolent sword, he says. He uses the term nonviolent sword. And Malcolm had called the March on Washington a farce on Washington, because he said they should have paralyzed the entire nation's capital to show, because what Malcolm wanted all of us to see, and Professor Lewis, you know as well as I do, in 2020, I think we've all seen it, was the depth and breadth of American racial inequality. Racism, if you want to call it racist policy, structural racism, white supremacy. Malcolm wanted all of us to see and then respond. But King, for a long time, is resistant to admitting the depth and breadth of this, right? And post 65, but I argue with the help of Malcolm, he comes to see it, and that King is a man on fire. That King is an extraordinary figure, and that King is the King that we sort of are uncomfortable with as a nation, even 52 years later.
You know, you keep Malcolm alive, though. You place him in the body of Stokely Carmichael. And that's quite interesting. And the presence of Stokely Carmichael, by invitation from Martin, to be in Ebenezer in the front row as King makes his most demandingly pacific statement about the sins of Vietnam and its consequences. That ties together, it seems to me, the sword and the shield in a way that is really quite corporeal. But I want to go back just a bit before that happens. You say that Watts, of course, explodes a few days, the week after Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act. King, at that point, makes a decision, or has made a decision, I should say, before the Voting Rights Act is passed, that has undercut the confidence of the SNCC students and the militants in his leadership. You mentioned that there is great controversy. I wonder, though, if in fact King did not accept a deal with the Justice Department, given being confronted with a federal injunction not to march, that he, of course, denied that there was no understanding at all, and that great march to Pettus Bridge, where he stops, he prays, and then it would appear embarrassed by the local constabulary, which parts the way so that he might have gone on.
And this is turnaround Tuesday, March 9th.
Yes, indeed. But King said no, that there was no deal. But I think the militants smelled a cop-out, thought there was. And indeed, I think there was. I think documentarily, we now know that Martin Luther King was presented the map which he should follow. That was a difficult decision indeed. But from my perspective, I think it was so costly that it will be years after King is gone that, in the largeness of what we see he was trying to do, that compromise is understandable. But it was quite costly to James Forman and to James Bevel and to Stokely Carmichael and others. And it's, I think, worth remembering, as we should, that a Messiah and a great figure is also at times a pragmatist.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's a great contrast with the king of Turnaround Tuesday to the king of Chicago and really even Memphis with the Poor People's Campaign, who even in the last speech on April 3rd, 1968, he proclaims that they didn't let dogs and fire hoses turn them around in Birmingham. And he says, we're not going to let any illegal injunctions turn us around in Memphis. So it's interesting, in that 3-year period, he travels quite a distance from really thinking about, injunctions as something that, look, he can't afford to ignore and bypass. And by 68, he's saying that's exactly what he's going to do. He doesn't get a chance to do it. He's assassinated the next day. But this idea that he is saying these are illegal injunctions against marching. King is no judge. He's not a lawyer. He's announcing this on the podium. So he's saying that there's higher morality that he's going to be dictated by, and not by the courts. So there is that distance that he travels.
Mm-hmm. Personal behavior is a big story in both men's lives, isn't it? In Malcolm's case, he discovers that the leader is in fact a corrupt person, that he's violating his oath of responsibility. There is some sexual assault, it seems, involved in some of the faithful women. And that has much to do with Malcolm's disaffiliation from the movement. But we also have Martin Luther King's alleged irregularities of a personal nature, which, of course, J. Edgar Hoover is, we believe, documenting quite carefully. What to say about the fallibility of leaders? Was Malcolm's disaffiliation based largely upon the sins of the leader, or was he simply outgrowing the leader, and this was simply a factor in his distancing of his leadership, Muhammad's leadership?
I think for Malcolm, it's a combination. I think Malcolm would have stayed longer in the Nation of Islam if Elijah Muhammad and the so-called royal family and what was going on in Chicago was on the up and up, and there wasn't that kind of corruption and inconsistency, sexual predation of vulnerable women. So I think he would have stayed longer. But I also think that unless he had been able to wrestle control of the entire organization, he was always going to be dissatisfied, because he wanted an organization that he had helped flourish from just a few hundred diehard members into tens of thousands because of him. He wanted that organization to be much more of a political organization, religious, yes, but much more secular. And what Elijah Muhammad and the family did was really utilize Malcolm's talents to have an extraordinary rise in leadership and just an extraordinary rise in personal wealth. Malcolm X helps the Nation of Islam really build generational wealth for the family. So I think he was always going to leave because he wanted to be part of not just the civil rights movement, what he calls the human rights movement. So we can see, and one of the interesting examples of the things about studying Malcolm is that you could see his ethical behavior, post-prison, is something that he really has fealty to this larger ideal of both being a Muslim, the religion of Islam, but this idea of human rights and human brotherhood, and that he is going to be an ethical exemplar of that. He lives it, right? So Malcolm X walks the talk, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. And so in that way, he's both an inspirational figure, but he's truly an exacting figure, because if somebody, it's interesting to contrast with Dr. King, because we all know now about Dr. King's fallibilities and the well documented, the plagiarism, the extramarital affairs, all these different things. So I think on one level, in real time, the fact that Martin King's surrogates witness that kind of fallibility, I think it makes him a much more real, earthy figure than Malcolm X is to his surrogates. Because what you find with Malcolm is that it's very, very hard to live up to a leader who is so is so puritanical, yes, in their personal lives, and also Malcolm financially too, right? King financially as well, right? There's no unethical behavior, but King, will have the drink and the smoke the cigarettes. With Malcolm, none of that is there. So I think one of the interesting things, even though Malcolm has a loyal group of lieutenants, that once he leaves the Nation of Islam, that keeps diminishing in concentric circles, and there's also a disloyal group of informers and FBI agents and New York police undercover officers as well, because I think Malcolm is an exacting figure to try to imitate. Most people can't. Most people will try and fail miserably. And I think once people fail in trying to imitate this kind of leader, what's so striking is that it leads to resentment, right?
The Hajj is, of course, a transformative moment experience for Malcolm. It really is, it seems to me, an epiphany, isn't it? When he says for the first time, although actually when he went to Egypt with Nasser, he had experienced the kind of rainbow coalition of the people. But this time it was much more impactful, it seems. And of course, it shouldn't be so surprising because to my experience or my discovery, he was profoundly affected by the promise of the Bandung Conference, which I think in civil rights history is a factoid. It was important certainly to Du Bois, to a few people, but for Malcolm, he glanced the universality of the issue of racial justice through that, and that is really quite something. And so there's a continuity when he is in Hajj and when he is in Africa. I can't resist mentioning my meeting Malcolm X when he came to Ghana on it was, I think, May
1964. Yeah,
1964.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
It's not particularly historical, except that I did ask him a question at the Ghana Press Club. It was filled to capacity, and I was a young professor then at the university, and I had just read something in somewhere that suggested that the tensions between Malcolm X's views and Martin Luther King's were significant and causing great ruptures in the civil rights community. And so I asked that question, that very question. What transpired was an awesome silence in the press club. And I think his eyes were blue, were they?
They're green, they're greenish. They're a little greenish. Yeah.
Yes.
Green.
The point is not my admiring the color of the eyes, except that the intensity of them, as he paused and looked at me and then explained that I should read more carefully the evidence of the various journals and what have you. And I much appreciated that. And I saw something else, that there were many nubile creatures present at the press conference, and his Puritanism, austerity was really quite evident. He left and went off on his way, and I think many in the audience regretted the fact that they mightn't have attracted his attention for a moment, just to speak and maybe to get to know him better. But he was on a mission, and off he went on his mission.
One thing I'll say about the Hajj is that, Malcolm Manning Marable's biography has a chapter, The Epiphany and the Hajj. And I'd say that it both is and it isn't, in the sense of this. Malcolm uses the Hajj to create a new origin story for himself that he needs in the aftermath of the split with the Nation of Islam. One of the things I argue is that a lot of what we see in 64 and 65 with Malcolm and the idea of human rights and turning the civil rights movement into the human rights movement, saying that white people who are sincere can be part of this revolution. He understood this as early as that first trip to the Middle East, but he was captured by the the religious organization he was in. He knew that he couldn't say that, and it wasn't tenable to say that and still remain the national representative of the Nation of Islam. So once he was out, and by the way, the person who finances his trips, the FBI is looking to see, is it the Saudis? Is it who's finance? It's his older sister, who's one of his most personal confidants, Ella Mae Collins, who was one of the three children that Earl Little had in his first marriage. And so she had been saving money for her own trip to Mecca to take the Hajj, and she loved her little brother so much, who she had brought to Boston in 1941 to live with her. She gave him the money to take the Hajj. So when we think about the 12, 14, 16, 18 postcards that Malcolm writes, he's writing to both white and black friends, journalists, interlocutors about the Epiphany and the Hajj. What he needs is an origin story, right? He needs to recreate himself in this sense. But it really is an evolution that, if we study Malcolm, had already been taking place internally if we know what cues to look for. But by 64, what the origin story does is allow us to say, oh, this is the new non-racist Malcolm X, right? Because there's an aspect of the Nation of Islam's anti-racism that traffics in racial essentialism by the origin story of Yaqub and the myth of the black scientist who creates white people who are genetically engineered and predisposed to committing great acts of evil against black people and people of color all over the world, and they're destined to rule for 1,000 years before the comeuppance happens, right? So, and that's one of the things that's so interesting about these origin stories is that every religion has an origin story that, to the naked eye, to somebody who's the uninitiated, can seem quite far-fetched. And it's not just the Nation of Islam. It's the Church of Latter-day Saints. You can be Episcopalian. You can be a Catholic. You can be a Christian. You can be a Muslim. You can be Jewish. You can have, all religions are based in origin stories that the initiated will say these origin stories are true. The uninitiated will say these seem like legends to me, and they seem like they're not. They're pretty far out there.
Well, far-fetched or lunacy. We should have some questions, and I think we do. I just have one question more, because I'd like to imagine how it would have felt to have been there, and that is that while Martin Luther King is on his way to Oslo to receive the Nobel Prize for Peace, Malcolm X is in the Oxford Union delivering an address that parodies Barry Goldwater's famous electoral speech that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the service of freedom is no virtue. And the impact on the Oxford students was really quite splendid, it seems.
Oh, absolutely. And the BBC broadcast that.
And the BBC broadcast it, indeed. So here we have Martin Luther King's address, Nobel address, being broadcast just a few days later.
Yes.
And we have this coming from the Oxford Union. And I think that's just cinematically a wonderful moment. And when your book is adapted, that will be a somatic element to it that will be quite appealing.
There's so many of those moments where they crisscross each other. It's uncanny. It's almost like they're orchestrating it. It's uncanny.
Well, I hope I can handle this, but I'm supposed to go to questions.
Yeah, I think there's 7.
Yes.
So it says question. See the questions.
Yeah, but I can't get my cursor to.
Okay, you have 7 questions. So you can scroll on them.
Yes.
So you can see what they say.
Yes. Well, okay. Well, this question is certainly timely. It is, have you had an opportunity to read the Les Payne biography, and what do you think of it?
Oh no, I think highly of it. It just won the National Book Award. I think the really great strength of that biography, besides how well written it is in the evolution of Malcolm Little into Malcolm X, right? I think by the time he becomes Malcolm X, there's some interesting chapters on Malcolm's meeting with the Klan in 1961. But the great strength of it is how he becomes Malcolm X, and you get a lot more, the most sort of thoroughly investigated aspect of his childhood and his becoming, and the impact that childhood, that adolescence, his wayward youth had on his family and his friends. Yeah.
There's, how do each man, I guess it's, the question is, how does each man inform John Lewis's future behavior?
Oh yeah, it's interesting with Malcolm X. John Lewis meets Malcolm in Africa, very famously in his memoir "Walking with the Wind." Says that when he was in Africa, everybody who had met with Malcolm told him that unless he was as radical in calling for racial justice as Malcolm, they didn't want to hear him. So he definitely talks about meeting Malcolm and finding Malcolm to be this protean figure. But certainly the person who John Lewis models his life after in many ways, not the electoral aspect is different, because Dr. King would have never run for any office, even as people wanted him and Dr. Spock to run on a ticket. Dr. King wouldn't have run, I believe, even as a protest candidate. But he models his life in terms of nonviolent discipline, in terms of loving your so-called enemy, not having enemy politics, in terms of Dr. King channeling the abolitionist Theodore Parker. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This idea of redemptive suffering and bearing witness. John Lewis famously has his skull cracked in 1961 as a freedom rider, and then on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday in 1965, and survives. And decades later, reconciled and hugged with people who had brutally beaten him. So this idea of redemptive suffering, this idea of leading with love and compassion and justice, is all things that John Lewis imbibed from Dr. King. He's about 11 years younger than Dr. King, but Dr. King was his idol. He listened to Dr. King on the radio. He wants to be a preacher and a seminarian. He becomes the youngest speaker at the March on Washington in 1963. And he really is seeking Dr. King's counsel and his example. So very, very much so. I think that John Lewis patterns himself in the Kingian tradition of nonviolence. And he becomes this figure who is always trying to be optimistic and hopeful about racial justice. And he may not absorb King's most revolutionary fire, but certainly the equanimity and the compassion becomes his model. Yeah.
There is a question, I think it asks if there are people you see on the horizon of civil rights and politics who embody the virtues and possibilities of both Malcolm and Martin?
Oh yeah, there are many. I mean, a lot of these are young Black women who are leading the charge, both as elected officials, but as grassroots organizers in terms of Black Lives Matter. So you think about Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors and Brittany Packnett and No Name, Tamika Mallory. Uh, um, uh, some veterans are Sherilyn Ifill, who heads the Legal Defense Fund.
Mm-hmm.
Reverend William Barber, right, and Moral Mondays and sort of the New Poor People's Campaign. So there's quite a few on the horizon. I think what's different now, as opposed to this period, is that you have multiple leaders. So you have many Ella Bakers and Fannie Lou Hamers, rather than these one or two or three figures who are the most popular mobilizers in the land, right? So that's, and in certain ways, I think that's made the freedom struggle stronger because it's less vulnerable. But I think it also has made it, for some people, less cinematic. They like having their one or two or three or four or five, kings and queens in that way, that they can keep on that Venn diagram and say that this is the story we want to tell. So in the 60s, you could sort of tell the movement from one perspective, not all perspective, through the story of Kings and Kennedys, right? Malcolms and other great families. But now it's much more of a panoramic. But I do see the Malcolm X struggle for Black dignity, radical Black dignity, and Dr. King's struggle for radical Black citizenship imbued in the Black Lives Matter movement. It's just that BLM has also amplified aspects of that movement. King and Malcolm dealt with intersectional issues. BLM deals with both intersectional issues, but also intersectional identity and sort of centering Black women, centering Black feminists, centering queer and LGBTQIA, to have sort of the most capacious movement that we've ever had in terms of justice in the country.
Yes. On that point, would you entertain some reservations about King's receptivity to women's leadership? Ella Baker said famously to me that the problem with the civil rights movement was the ministers busy raising their salaries, but not our aspirations. And there was perhaps a whiff, I should say, of patriarchy in the movement. And of course, that is to be regretted insofar as it prevented successful participation by many women. And to follow that a bit, I think we know that the freedom movement, the Mississippi Summer, had the unfortunate consequence in that many young collegians participating in the movement on behalf of SNCC and those who wanted to register people to vote, they left Mississippi believing that they had been treated as simply pencil sharpeners and women who were to accommodate the male leadership. And out of that came, in fact, feminism. And that's
the aspects of second wave, right? Second wave white and Black feminism. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that the movement is patriarchal, both Malcolm and Martin's leadership. I think that there are Black women who are obviously organizing and combating against that. I think that Malcolm evolves probably more on this than King. He starts to say that the African countries and going to Ghana, where you met him, and other places, he starts to argue that the best African revolutionaries were co-equals with their women, men and women, and that this movement had to do the same thing. He, brings along Lynn Shiflett and other Black women who become part of the Organization for Afro-American Unity, his new organization, his new secular organization. I think with King, yes, I mean, Baker has that criticism. It's justified criticism. King has a much longer road to travel. I think he would have, over time, been receptive if he had been given a chance to develop. But in real time, he wasn't. And it's a shame, because obviously he could have learned a lot from Ella Baker.
Indeed.
You know, and so it's a shame. But Malcolm, for his part, you know, he meets up with Fannie Lou Hamer. You know, he says, look, she's one of the foremost freedom fighters in the country. So he's absolutely evolving in real time. And I think it's because Malcolm's traveling and meeting with Black women who are not just activists, but who are leaders and organizers and mobilizers, both in the United States and in the Middle East and in Africa.
This is a question that yes. How does the book, how is it different from James Cone's book on Martin and Malcolm? You mentioned your obligation to that work.
I think that's a brilliant book, Malcolm and Martin, you know, American Dream versus Nightmare, which came out in 1991. I think it's paperback, maybe in '89, the original publication. I think that's a brilliant book, but I think that even as towards the end, Dr. Cone discusses convergences. So it's not that he doesn't, but the book is really premised on a framework of polarities and polarization. And so what I do in The Sword and the Shield is really, I argue against those polarities. I argue that these are dual sides of a revolutionary coin, the sword and the shield. And we think of Malcolm as a political sword and King as the political shield, but they're actually both. There are times that Malcolm is that shield, and there are times that King is that sword. And when we braid their lives together, because it's really a dual braided intellectual political biography, we're better able to see that alongside of each other. And what we see is over time, whereas Malcolm was 100% sure what Black people needed was radical Black dignity, and King was 100% sure that Black people needed radical Black citizenship, by the time they meet at the US Senate, as you said, Professor Lewis, on March 26, 1964, they start to see that you need both. You need Black dignity and citizenship. Malcolm defined Black dignity as ending world white supremacy and Black people having political self-determination. Dr. King defined citizenship as not just the absence of racial oppression, but the visible appearance of justice, which he defined as more than voting rights and the end of segregation. He defined it as a universal basic income, decent housing, healthcare, all the things that we all want as citizens. But he defined those as rights and not privileges. Because I think most of us, the way who are on a webinar like this, we take for granted the childcare, the healthcare, all these different things that we have, the ability to be safe. And King wanted every single American to have that, every single person around the world to have that. And so I argue for convergence. And when we think about that convergence, we're able to better see the reverberations of these iconic leaders in our own time.
This is, as a historian, I shouldn't ask for predictions, but if King had survived 1968, would we have perceived that the influence of Marx was profoundly strong upon him, or, as other interpreters argue, it was really the church being fulfilled in its evangelical inclusiveness?
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think that King was interested in social democracy, even more so after the trip to Oslo that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So King is on the ground seeing it, and he's saying, this is great. And I also think King is really a faith leader and a man of great faith who has his own shortcomings, but his faith never abandons him. So I think he would have deepened, his faith would have deepened, but I think he was very much interested in social democracy. So less Marxism and maybe a vision of historical materialism, and more of a social democratic safety net that was capacious enough so that when he visited places like Marks, Mississippi, the poorest zip code in the United States, he wouldn't be in tears from seeing the depth of poverty there. I mean, I think one of the most moving parts for me was when we see him in Marks, Mississippi, and he's in tears, and Andy Young is there, Ralph Abernathy is there, and he's in tears in Marks, Mississippi, because there's all these folks with no shoes, they don't have decent clothes. And King, and this is a very interesting, he says to them that the way you are living is a crime. And we're going to go to Washington and we're going to sort this out. And I love that, because the person who had originally used that analogy of a crime and Black people being victims of a crime, even as they were being called criminal, which is the irony, was Malcolm X. Malcolm always accused the racist power structure in the country, or white America as a whole, of committing a series of crimes against Black people, which is why I say he's the prosecuting attorney, and which is why the hate that hate produced is such a bracing documentary for people to see, because you see that prosecutor speaking about racism in ways that really the country had never heard before.
I'd never heard. Well, Professor Joseph, this has been a wonderful meeting, and I think though there are more questions, our time is up, and we shall have to say goodbye.
No, thank you. It's an honor. It's a real honor, and I know everybody on the webinar came to see you, as they should. And I teach Du Bois, and now it's in one volume, which is great. My colleague, one of your former students, Dr. Field, Kendra Field, did the single volume, helped you produce the single volume. But the 2 volumes on Du Bois are intellectual models that will stand the test of time. It's a lifetime achievement. But all the work, When Harlem is in Vogue, is a model of a group biography, which I still go back to and go back to and go back to. So the work you've produced is just amazing and an exemplar. And anybody who's writing biography in the world, the first person they should be looking to is Dr. David Levering Lewis.
Thank you very much.
No, absolutely. It's my pleasure. It's a real thrill.
And so let me see.
Must be a way to leave.